afternoon. Welcome. I'm Susan Jasper. I'm a community engagement specialist. I work at Parks Library and the Ames Library, and I was really excited when working this event came my way because I've always wanted to come as a participant. And I want to let you all know that the library's mission is to connect you to the power of ideas through diverse and inclusive resources and programs. And we always welcome program proposal ideas at our website. And I wanted to mention that we do have some materials right as you come in the room. And I know Greg has some information about the Outdoor Alliance, and there's other things. We also have a cart at the back with some books from our collection that related to today's topic. So if you have a chance to look at that, those would be great. And then we just had a programming team meeting and decided that we are going to stop printing flyers for the most part for our events to save paper and also to save some staff frustrations because there's a lot of programs going on in here. So I just wanted to show everyone at our new webpage where you can find out what's going on at the library if you don't have a printout of it on your fridge from an event like this. So you can go to events and news, and the page one newsletter is an option. You can subscribe to get that in your email box. I always just go through and put everything I'm interested in on the calendar, so that fills up fast. And then you can also click on this month's or any month's page one newsletter and read more details there. Another really nice feature about this new website is we have an event calendar. So when you pop over there, you have an option to do a keyword search, which I have not really played around with. You can select adults if you just know that your programming interests are going to be refined that way. And as you hover over an event, it gives you the information on that event. But if you continue and click on that, and if it's part of a series, it gives you all the dates and all the information on those. So two useful places you might visit on our new website. I'm still finding things and saying, could you put that up front? So we welcome your feedback on that as well. So without further ado, I'm going to ask Bruce to come and introduce the afternoon.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to it's either our 11th or 12th, and I'm confused, or if this is the 11th year that we've done Ames Reach Leopold here in Ames, or do you know, do you have a recollection?
I think this was the 11th year.
Okay, I wasn't sure it was 11 or 12, but anyway, for a decade we've been hosting Ames Reach Leopold here in Ames, and well, you know, my name is Bruce White. I'm a retired agroforester and also a member of the Outdoor Alliance of Story County and one of the organizers for this afternoon's event. I want to start off by thanking our sponsors that are listed in the back of the program. Well, first I need to do this disclaimer from the Aldo Leopold Foundation in Wisconsin that they provide a lot of the visuals and so forth. These are all the credits that we have to acknowledge when we're using some of their materials. But we have had a lot of assistance from a number of partnerships, and so appreciate that. And as far as those that were involved in helping the planning of that, I want to especially thank all of those that were involved in helping line up speakers. Hats off to Jerry Neal, especially. She did a lot of work on a couple of segments for this afternoon's program, so I really appreciate that. She does things down. And Mary's not here, but I'll tell Susan that to thank Mary Logston, who's Adult Services Director and has been acting director here at the library recently. A very busy person, but Mary's been a strong supporter of this event over the years, and she was, again, very helpful in helping us out. And as well as the folks from Iowa State, a number of folks there, a couple of new, Kevin Ellis is not here with us. He's a graduate student he's at a conference, and he assisted with Sustainable Ag Student Association and helping recruit some folks there. So appreciate Kevin's assistance. And last but not least, I thank all of you that, a lot of you that are in the audience are going to be reading this afternoon. And I appreciate you taking your time out for this semi-gorgeous day. It's pretty sunny out, a little on the cool side, but still real nice to be out enjoying the natural world as Aldo Leopold would like you to be. So why do we still go back to Aldo Leopold's works and efforts? The Sand County Almanac, we are celebrating the 70th anniversary of its printing back in 1949. So it's the 70th year that's been in print. And it's continued to be a relevant document, at least in my mind, and I think many of you that read it have read it or continue to read it off and on, find that it still is very apropos to some of the issues and concerns that were in evidence in his day back in the 30s and 40s. But certainly today we still face soil erosion and soil health issues. We still have water quality and air quality issues. Population growth is continuing to be a concern. And as we move today, ever-pressing issue, which you had a great series for the last couple of months here at the library that Herb was helped sponsor, is on climate change. And hopefully this afternoon we'll try to go a little bit towards that climate change issue. We asked a couple of Leopold experts on what would Aldo Leopold, what would he be thinking about as far as what we face today with climate change issues. And they kind of scratched their heads a little bit too, but we did get some pretty good quotes from Kurt Mine, who is a biographer for Aldo Leopold. His book's on the back table there. I encourage you to take a look at it. So I think there are a lot of issues that we still face today in this 21st century that Aldo Leopold also faced in the mid-20th century. And in my mind, some of these issues today are more pressing perhaps even than they were back during the Dust Bowl days and some of the great issues we had in the 30s and 50s when we had some drought issues back then. And also, Sand County Almanac is still recognized as a fine example of nature writing. It's been translated into 13 different languages around the world, so it's being read by many people in all parts of the world. So I urge you today to pay careful attention to the words of Aldo Leopold as you hear the different folks read, and how some of it's very poetic and some is rather humorous in some of his phrasing. So I think it's very interesting that someone living at that time period is still so relevant today. This year we're adding something different to our readings. We're going to be adding something for the Reimagined Leopold exhibition that was created last fall, or in 2018 at least, and primarily in response to the defunding of the Leopold Center for Sustainable Agriculture at Iowa State. So we have a couple people with us that were intimately involved with that project. One of the projects was a Correspondence Project that Kathranne and Kevin will be reading some excerpts from later this afternoon. So really appreciate you being here and being a participant in this. And if you haven't, their exhibition was created and was in the React Gallery in Morrill Hall last fall. And I got a chance to go over and visit it, thought, oh, very appropriate for this event. So thanks to Susan and Kevin and Kathranne and others, they were able to bring part of that exhibit, not the complete exhibit. Part of the exhibit is upstairs in the gallery of the library. So if you go upstairs and then we get the top stairs, turn left, and it'll be in the hallway over there. So some very interesting pieces to reflect upon as you have a chance to visit. It's been up for a week, and it will be up for another week, so if we run out of time this afternoon for you to go up and take a look, you'll have all next week to go visit it and share your thoughts. And Kevin is going to talk more about this later, but part of this exhibition is an interactive exhibit, so we ask for input. He's asking for additional thoughts, reactions, reflections, and he'll explain that a little bit later. But you'll have an opportunity, we'd ask you to reflect on not only what you're hearing this afternoon, but also what you're seeing in the exhibit upstairs. As you noted when you came in, there are refreshments in the back. We're going to be a free informal gathering today. We're going to have a couple of scheduled breaks, but if you need to get up, get a cup of coffee, help yourself go to the back. There's some scones and muffins and so forth, and some fruit in the back. So help yourself to that. That's compliments of the Friends of Ames Public Library. Also, you should have picked up a program you didn't see as you came in. They're on this table in the middle and back here. There's also a whole big roll of red tickets. Thanks to the Center for the Sustainable Ag Center at Iowa State, we still have about a dozen copies of Sand County Almanac. And so we're going to have a couple of drawings to give away some copies of Sand County Almanac. So fill in the little red ticket, tear it in half, put your name in the box, and keep the other half. So we're going to call out the number later, whatever it is. So if you don't have a copy, here's your chance. So with that. Any questions? Oh, I did one last thing I made note myself. I did have an evaluation form, a little brief evaluation forms on the other back table. Sometime during the day, if you wouldn't mind picking that up and jotting down your thoughts. We're always looking for different ideas, how we might do this differently next year. In looking at the website, we are going to try to move it back into March if we get the date selected, so that it'd be more in concert with Leopold Weekend in Wisconsin, but also traditionally Iowa celebrates Leopold Week about the first week in March. And so we may be looking at some other ideas. I know in Wisconsin they do hikes, they do a variety of different things. They build Leopold benches. So we're always open for any ideas you might have for how we might do things a little differently in another year. So with that, I'm going to turn to Irv Kloss, who is our first reader, and is going to talk about the foreword from the Sand County Almanac.
Thanks, Bruce. I want to thank Bruce and Mark Rasmussen and anyone else that helped keep this tradition alive. We started out not knowing what was going to lead, but here we are, I think, 11 or 12 years back later. Aldo Leopold Weekend, actually, started in March 4th, 2000, in the town of Lodi, Wisconsin. That day, over 10 hours, 2 locations, and 35 readers, citizens of this very small community, read A Sand County Almanac aloud, cover to cover, as a way to develop a sense of place, build community bonds, and introduce the concept of a land ethic. In 2004, the first weekend of March was officially designated as Aldo Leopold Weekend in the state of Wisconsin by the state legislature. And now I think there are over 35 communities in Wisconsin that do this. In Iowa, I think there are maybe 3. And actually, Leopold was born in Burlington, and so we can claim him as one of our as well, although he spent most of his later life in Wisconsin. He was well known among conservationists long before the publication of the Sand County Almanac. And his friend and student, H. Albert Hochbaum, probably had the keenest sense of Leopold's status at the time. He wrote to Leopold in 1944, and he said, if you will put yourself in perspective, you might realize that within your realm of influence, which is probably larger than you know, Aldo Leopold is considerably more than a person. In fact, he is probably less of a person than a standard. And that was a very gracious tribute, I thought. Well, I'm going to read the foreword to A Sand County Almanac from a book that is printed on paper that was developed from the pine trees that Aldo Leopold planted. It's one of my prized possessions. He wrote this in 1948, just before he died. There are some who can live without wild things, and some who cannot. These essays are the delights and dilemmas of one who cannot. Like winds and sunsets, wild things were taken for granted until progress began to do away with them. Now we face the question whether a still higher standard of living is worth its cost in things natural, wild, and free. For us, of the minority, the opportunity to see geese is more important than television, and the chance to find a past flower is a right as inalienable as free speech. These wild things, I admit, had little human value until machination assured us of a good breakfast and until science disclosed the drama of where they come from and how they live. The whole conflict, thus, boils down to a question of degree. We of the minority see a law of diminishing returns in progress. Our opponents do not. Conservation is getting nowhere because it is incompatible with our Abrahamic concept of land. We abuse land because we regard it as a commodity belonging to us. When we see land as a community to which we belong, we may begin to use it with love and respect. There is no way for land to survive the impact of mechanized man, nor of us to reap from it the aesthetic harvest it is capable, under science, of contributing to this culture. That land as a community is the basic concept of ecology. But that land is to be loved and respected is an extension of ethics. The land yields a cultural harvest is a fact long known, but lately often forgotten. Those essays attempt to weld these three concepts. Such a view of land and people is, of course, subject to the blurs and distortions of personal experience and personal bias. But wherever the truth may lie, this much is crystal clear. Our bigger and better society is now like a hypochondriac, so obsessed with its own economic health as to have lost the capacity to remain healthy. The whole world is so greedy for more bathtubs that it has lost the stability necessary to build them, or even to turn off the tap. Nothing could be more salutary at this stage than a little healthy contempt for a plethora of material blessings. Perhaps such a shift of values can be achieved by reappraising things unnatural, tame, and confined in terms of things natural, wild, and free.
Our next speaker is Adam Janke. Adam is a wildlife extension specialist at Iowa State University in the Natural Resources, Ecology, and Management Department. And Adam, we'll hear from you on If I Were the Wind.
Thanks, Bruce. Excited to be here today. First time I've ever come to the program. I'm fancy myself a Leopold enthusiast. And Bruce asked me to share my thoughts on the essay before I shared it. So since Dr. Kloss did this, I'll tell you the story of my Leopold book. I bought this because I was required to buy it in 2007 for a class I was taking at Purdue when I was studying to become a wildlife biologist, and have pretty well worn it down since then. Lots of pencil markings and pin markings reflecting different perceptions through time. So this was actually an essay that I didn't have marked up at all. I don't know if that means I read it really fast or if it was just maybe, I don't know. I did enjoy it, and I particularly enjoyed coming back to it. And I found myself right there along with him on the banks of the Wisconsin River and describing it. So I'll let it go. The wind that makes music in November corn is in a hurry. The stalks hum, the loose husks whisk skyward in half playful swirls and the wind hurries on. The marsh, long windy waves surge across the glossy sloughs, beat against the far willows. A tree tries to argue, bare limbs waving, but there is no detaining the wind. On the sandbar there is only wind, and the river sliding seaward. Every wisp of grass is drawing circles on the sand. I wander over the bar to a driftwood log, where I sit and listen to the universal roar and to the tinkle of wavelets on the shore. The river is lifeless, not a duck, heron, marsh hawk, or gull, but has sought refuge from wind. Out of the clouds I hear a faint bark, as of a faraway dog. It is strange how the world cocks its ears at that sound wandering. Soon it is louder, the honk of geese, invisible but coming on. The flock emerges from the low clouds, a tattered banner of birds, dipping and rising, blown up and blown down, blown together and blown apart, but advancing, the wind wrestling lovingly with each winnowing wing. When the flock is a blur in the far sky, I hear the last honk, sounding taps for summer. It is warm behind the driftwood now, for the wind has gone with the geese. So would I if I were the wind.
Thank you, Adam. It's always, you think about, I go on Hayden almost daily, and this time of year, there's a few less geese, but there's a lot more other types of waterfowl out there as well. So, but hearing the geese coming over my head as I'm walking my dog around the Hayden is always a bit of a shock some mornings. If I'm not awake, I will be having to honk at me as I go over. Our next speaker is Lydia English, and Lydia is going to be reading The Coral Copse.
Thanks, Bruce. Similar to Adam, I also bought this book because it was required of me for a nature writing class in undergrad. But I am happy to be coming back to this event and revisiting it because it's long overdue. So I'm going to be reading September, The Coral Copse. By September, the day breaks with little help from birds. A song sparrow may give a single half-hearted song, a woodcock may twitter overhead en route to his daytime thicket, a barred owl may terminate the night's argument with one last wavering call, but few other birds have anything to say or sing about. It is on some, but not all, of these misty autumn daybreaks that one may hear the chorus of the quail. The silence is suddenly broken by a dozen contralto voices, no longer able to restrain their praise of the day to come. After a brief minute or two, the music closes as suddenly as it began. There is a peculiar virtue in the music of elusive birds. Songsters that sing from topmost boughs are easily seen and as easily forgotten. They have the mediocrity of the obvious. What one remembers is the invisible hermit thrush pouring silver chords from the impenetrable shadows, the soaring crane trumpeting from behind a cloud, the prairie chicken booming from the mists of nowhere, the quail's Ave Maria in the hush of dawn. No naturalist has ever seen the coral act, for the covey is still on its invisible roost in the grass, and any attempt to approach automatically induces silence. In June, it is completely predictable that the robin will give voice when the light intensity reaches 0.01 candle power, and that the bedlam of other singers will follow in predictable sequence. In autumn, on the other hand, the robin is silent, and it is quite unpredictable whether the covey chorus will occur at all. The disappointment I feel on these mornings of silence perhaps shows that things hoped for have a higher value than things assured. The hope of hearing quail is worth half a dozen risings in the dark. My farm always has one or more coveys in autumn, but the daybreak chorus is usually distant. I think this is because the coveys prefer to roost as far as possible from the dog, whose interest in quail is even more ardent than my own. One October dawn, however, as I sat sipping coffee by the outdoor fire, a chorus burst into song hardly a stone's throw away. They had roosted under a white pine copse, possibly to stay dry during the heavy dews. We felt honored by this daybreak hymn sung almost at our doorstep, Somehow the blue autumnal needles on those pines became thenceforth bluer, and the red carpet of dewberry under those pines became even redder.
Thank you, Lydia. Reflecting back on coverage of quail, I grew up in Madison County, southwest of Des Moines, and near Winterset, and on a small farm, and I was a bird hunter back then. I'm not much of a bird hunter anymore, but I always could hear, we almost always get a covey of quail to scatter on a given fall day. And as I go back and walk over that farm today, I hardly ever hear a quail. I know quail numbers are way down, but always hearing that bobflight call was always something I really enjoyed as I worked on the farm. Our next speaker is Dan Goodall. Dan is the executive director for the White Rock Conservancy over at Coon Rapids. And Dan, we appreciate you driving over from Coon Rapids to be with us today. And Dan's going to share with us the great possessions.
Good afternoon. White Rock is one of the places that you're all welcome to come and visit, and it's a place where you can actually hopefully still experience a little bit of, maybe a shadow of what Aldo Leopold experienced in some of his journeys. This morning I went out for a walk, and turkey vultures were out, and you get up close, they're a rather large bird. I think they've been having some trouble with turkey vultures here in Ames, I've heard, but there's also an eagle's nest there that's active, and they probably have babies in it, and we've got plenty of geese there. The pelicans have long since, so a few days have passed us over. Last year they stayed on the pond, and we had a big raft of pelicans there for a while. And we look forward to having dick sissels and bobolinks there, which easy to see, which isn't so easy to see in a lot of places anymore in Iowa. So just some of the variety of birds that you can experience when you come out to White Rock. So you're all invited to come out. I hope you can come out soon. 120 acres, according to the county clerk, is the extent of my worldly domain. But the county clerk is a sleepy fellow who never looks at his record books before 9 o'clock. What they would show at daybreak is the question here at issue. Books or no books, it is a fact, patent both to my dog and myself, that at daybreak I am the sole owner of all the acres I can walk over. It is not only boundaries that disappear, but also the thought of being bounded. Expanses unknown to deed or map are known to every dawn and solitude, supposed no longer to exist in my county, extends on every hand as far as the dew can reach. Like other great landowners, I have tenants. They are negligent about rents, but very punctilious about tenures. Indeed, at every daybreak from April till July, they proclaim their boundaries to each other, and so acknowledge, at least by inference, their fiefdom to me. This daily ceremony, contrary to what you might suppose, begins with the utmost decorum. Who originally laid down its protocols, I do not know. At 3:30 a.m., with such dignity as I can muster of a July morning, I step from my cabin door, bearing in either hand my emblems of sovereignty, a coffee pot and a notebook. I seat myself on a bench, facing the white wake of the morning star. I set the pot beside me. I extract a cup from my shirt front, hoping none will notice its informal mode of transport. I get out my watch, pour coffee, and lay notebook on me. This is the cue for the proclamations to begin. At 3:35, the nearest field sparrow avows in a clear tenor chant that he holds the jack pine copse north of the river bank and south to the old wagon track. One by one, all the other field sparrows within the earshot recite their respective holdings. There are no disputes, at least at this hour, so I just listen, hoping inwardly that their womenfolk acquiesce in the happy accord over the status quo ante. Before the field sparrows have quite gone the rounds, the robin in the big elm warbles loudly his claim to the crotch, where the ice storm tore off a limb, and all appurtenances pertaining thereto, meaning in this case, all the angleworms and the not very spacious subadjacent lawn. The robin's insistent caroling awakens the oriole, who now tells the world of orioles that the pendant branch of the elm belongs to him, together with all the fiber-bearing milkweed stalks nearby, all the loose strings in the garden, and the exclusive right to flash like a burst of fire from one of these to another. My watch says 3:50. The indigo bunting on the hill asserts title to the dead oak limb left by the 1936 drought, and to diverse nearby bugs and bushes. He does not claim, but I think he implies, the right to out-blue all bluebirds and all spiderworts that have turned their faces to the dawn. Next, the wren, the one who discovered the knothole in the eave of the cabin, explodes into song. Half a dozen other wrens give voice, and now all is bedlam. Grosbeaks, thrashers, yellow warblers, bluebirds, vireos, cowies, cardinals, all are at it. My solemn list of performers, in their order and time of first song, hesitates, wavers, ceases, for my ear can no longer filter out the priorities. Besides, the pot is empty, and the sun is about to rise. I must inspect my domain before my title runs out. We sally forth, the dog and I, at random. He has paid scant respect to all these vocal goings-on, for to him the evidence of tenantry is not song, but scent. Any illiterate bundle of feathers, he says, can make a noise in a tree. Now, he is going to translate for me the olfactory poems that who knows what silent creatures have written in the summer night. At the end of each poem sits the author, if we can find him. What we actually find is beyond predicting. A rabbit suddenly yearning to be elsewhere, a woodcock fluttering his disclaimer, a cock pheasant indignant over wetting his feathers in the grass. Once in a while, we turn up a coon or mink returning late from the night's foray. Sometimes we rout a heron from his unfinished fishing, or surprise a mother wood duck with her covey of ducklings, headed full steam for the shelter of the pickerel weeds. Sometimes we see deer sauntering back to the thickets, replete with alfalfa blooms, veronica, and wild lettuce. More often, we see only the interweaving darkened lines that lazy hoofs have traced on the silken fabric of the dew. I can feel the sun now. The bird chorus has run out of breath. The far clank of cowbells bespeaks a herd ambling to pasture. A tractor roars warning that my neighbor is astir. The world has shrunk to those mean dimensions known to county clerks. We turn toward home and breakfast.
The next speaker is Kathranne Knight. Kathranne has an artistic background, so coming at it from a little different viewpoint. And Kathranne, if I pronounce your first name wrong, let me know.
Kathranne.
Kathranne. Just going to read a couple of segments from a project, and I'll let her talk a little bit more about the project. That I found very interesting, and there are several copies up in the gallery in the exhibit if you want to take a look at it. They ask you to read it and then return it back, I think is what the sign says. So I'll ask Kathranne to come up and read a couple of our diary entries from over the summer, last summer.
Thank you, Bruce. So I will be reading from the Correspondence Project, and what I will do is read what I sent out to my fellow collaborators. I'll read this first. Dear collaborators, I invite you to participate in a correspondence project, reimagining the Leopold Center for Sustainable Agriculture, where, for 1 week, you keep a digital, daily field note. The notes are an experiment where we wander, collect, notice, notate, and reflect with the twin mandates of the traditional field note: descriptive information and reflective information, objective and subjective. The Leopold Center for Sustainable Agriculture recently lost its state funding. While the center still physically exists, it does so in an extremely pared-down state, limiting its ability to support research. How can we continue to ask questions surrounding the critical issues facing farmers who wish to incorporate sustainable practices? The focus of your daily communication to the group will be to incorporate the Leopold Center for Sustainable Agriculture's history, connections between their work and your life, land, the writings of Aldo Leopold, and wild, open speculation on a future land ethic. We're interested in play, free thinking, and ambitious dreaming or action grounded in your readings and observations. We encourage you to walk and wander, observe, ruminate, make, and mark. Find where you connect to the land. Question the status quo. We will begin Monday, July 2nd and end Sunday, July 8th. Each day, please email your submission to the whole group. So the booklet was published in tandem with the exhibition Reimagining Leopold at the React Gallery, and the funding was provided by the Leopold Center for Sustainable Agriculture. Okay, so the first submission is from Lydia English. Monday, July 2nd, 5:45 p.m., Squaw Creek Park, sunny, 82 degrees. I've been neglecting my garden recently, and so I tolerated the mosquitoes to pull the weeds, the former inadvertently facilitating the growth of the latter. The surprise for me this year is my runner beans, old seed that took a while to germinate, but have taken off and are flowering nicely. I'm hopeful they are robust enough to continue to withstand the deer browsing, so that I can get enough beans to save for next year's garden. When I came home, I decided to flip through a book of Leopold essays and figured what is a weed would be an apt choice for this evening. It starts, quote, "To live in harmony with plants is, or should be, the ideal of good agriculture. To call every plant a weed, which cannot be fed to livestock or people, is, I fear, the actual practice of agricultural colleges," end quote. The essay goes on to enumerate the many native prairie species, rigid goldenrod, black-eyed Susan, that are listed as weeds in the weed flora of Iowa. While I will continue to uproot that which I did not plant for aesthetic and practical purposes, it reminded me that not everything that ends up near the tomatoes should be, quote, blacklisted for general persecution, end quote. You know what I think I love about that particular submission is just how it follows Leopold's mindfulness. Weather, partly cloudy, 76 degrees. To solve the water quality problem we have in Iowa, we need to be looking for opportunities wherever they present themselves. This is a complex, massive issue, but it is not unsolvable. In the fall of 2014, my wife and I moved to an 1890s fixer-upper in the country south of Searing. When we arrived, the property contained the house, barn, shop, corn crib, a nice mix of trees, and about 4 acres of mowed grass. In the time we've been here, the grass has been transformed into tall grass prairie, and we've planted numerous native trees and shrubs. In the first 2 years, we jumped for joy at seeing any blooming common milkweed or black-eyed Susan. Now our property is well on its way to being a native oasis, and in the last few months of this year, we have seen countless native birds, including goldfinch, cedar waxwings, bluebirds, and many more. Not to mention that the milkweed we seeded has created a veritable monarch factory. 75%, over 20 million acres of Iowa's land area is taken up by corn and soybeans. That is a huge opportunity, a nearly blank canvas that is available to design a solution. I have seen that capacity for this land to transform from a mowed grass lawn or a row crop field into the prairie that can sustain both this world and our species. And that was written by Tim Youngquist, who is agriculture specialist with the STRIPS program at Iowa State. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathranne. Those were a couple that Jerry, Neal, and I were going through the Correspondence Project booklet together and trying to pick out some, and those two spoke to us, for sure. I remember growing up on the farm, my job was mowing grass, and it seemed like we had 4 acres of grass on that farmstead as well, but there used to be a lot of prairie there. With that, it's time to take a little break, open up for discussion, reflection. I would offer, if you want to get up and get something to eat from the back table, you're more than welcome to do that. Let me ask you first if you have any reaction to these first few essays that we've heard this afternoon. Anything that struck you as, in my mind, the ones that we featured were kind of light and celebratory, you might say, of what Leopold observed on this near his shack near Baraboo, Wisconsin. But I think there are many of those same things that he commented on are things that we see here throughout Iowa as well. So any reaction anyone might have about those first few essays?
I have one thought. When I listen to them again, I love these readings, is this all sometimes feels so serious to me, at least, and to many of us that fight these good fights. And his use that kind of light touch of humor, just here and there, a little bit of humor and that kind of way to approach and couch things. That's just invaluable. And it's a great insight. So I love that about his writing, and it helps me. Like, take a breath. Just can be okay.
In some of the discussion questions I reviewed a little bit before today, that on this first segment from what Irv read and so forth, there were some questions about how do various groups in American society currently determine the value of wild things. I think it's one to ponder, that how do we value wild things today, and how is that demonstrated? And how do disagreements about values play out? Those are rather thought-provoking questions given our current conditions in this country today, I guess, as far as some of the dichotomy of opinions and values that many people have. But when it comes to nature and to wild things that are among us, I think that many of us still value some of the same things that Leopold did back in 40, 70 years ago. Any thoughts on how you think the values, how have our values changed towards wild things over the last 70 years? Any reflections on that?
too early for
So
things
when you say 70 years, that means by the time most of us were born.
True. It was like, well, pretty close to it. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, Kevin.
Well, I think that in context of Leopold, who had the conversion about the wolf, who went from persecutor to protector, you know, I think most of us are the movies and Disney and everything. We know we don't outwardly think we have to exterminate things, but it's a much more passive, quiet relationship. But it doesn't seem like it's fundamentally that different. It's more like we can't afford to take care of them versus we actually have to go out and get rid of things.
Mark?
Just a couple days ago, there was some news from South Dakota that reminded me of Leopold's change of heart with regards to predators in his first part of his career and second. Because South Dakota has implemented a bounty on fox, possum, raccoon, and, you know, the logic being that this is going to help the pheasant population. And I wonder, you know, and the governor signed this, and they had a big hoopla about it, and of course there are people who are opposed to this thinking, because you bring in a tail, I don't remember what the price you get for it, but they were praising this as a way to get younger people out there and in touch with nature. And it just brought me back to Leopold's change of mind with regards to the role of predators.
Right. And he had quite a transformation in his mind with the wolf. Yeah. Okay.
When I was a little boy, there was no such thing as a popular concept of this conservation. They just lived, and they took it and used it and usually threw it away. It wasn't until my generation came along, the baby boom generation, and not only we did the sex, drugs, and rock and roll that we're supposed to be doing all the time, but we also kind of discovered the idea that conservationism is a worthy. And it wasn't until Earth Day started that we started getting news coverage of it. And a lot of the progress we've had is convincing the news media and the visual media to make something of this. And that kind of brought it to the attention. And water sinks slowly through marble heads, so it's now getting to the point where people are really realizing that we have to do something. But it took like 25 years for them to kind of awaken to this. But it's been a slow process. When you look at the tobacco industry and how they knock that down, it takes time to be able to do that. And once you recognize that it's going to come in little bits at first and little bigger steps as it goes along, then you can recognize where you are in your progress. But if you want instant success, it's not going to happen. Especially when you're trying to change an entire cultural view. But it can be done, but you have to look at the success of others and see how they did it. Just duplicate that, and it's a slow process, but it is progressing now to where more and more people are involved in it.
Any other reactions? Yes?
Yeah, when you think about Leopold, and when we talked about, or the reading that we just had about the dream we could have of the row crops turning into prairies. I think for that to happen, we have to look at our economy and see how we have to really figure out a new economy. We can't keep going the way we've been going because it is destroying us.
Yeah, I think,
And does Leopold even address that?
I was going to say, keep that thought, because as we move into the latter part of the sections in the land ethic discussion, I think that'll come back around again as far as the economic aspect. So, we need to keep moving along so we don't get kicked out of the library later. So we'll move on to the second segment. We turn just a little different reflection, I think. You'll note that marshland elegy is our primary essay, and it's a fairly lengthy one. So we asked two people to trade off reading it. So Mary and Deborah come forward. Mary's ranking with the Sustainability Office at Iowa State, and Deborah's with the English Department at Iowa State.
I'm Deborah Marquardt from the English department, and I teach in the MFA program in creative writing and environment. And I thought it might be useful to contextualize this particular marshland elegy in terms of arts and poetry, because the word elegy is a poetic term, and it's a centuries-old tradition within poetry to meditate and contemplate loss, grief, usually within the context of death. And another part of the elegy is that it's often characterized by consolation. That often the elegy will plunge the reader into the depths of grief and bring them out into a point of consolation. I think that this particular chapter, it's in the Wisconsin section, the Marshland Elegy, does do that. And I think the way that Leopold accomplishes this is by taking a long view of the planetary history and speaking at an almost a geological scale about the succession of events that not only shaped this marsh, but then the succession of creatures who find a home here. Marshland Elegy. A dawn wind stirs on the great marsh. With almost imperceptible slowness, it rolls a bank of fog across the wide morass. Like the white ghost of a glacier, the mists advance, riding over phalanxes of tamarack, sliding across bog meadows heavy with dew. A single silence hangs from horizon to horizon. Out of some far recess of the sky, a tinkling of little bells falls soft upon the listening land. Then again, silence. Now comes a baying of some sweet-throated hound, soon the clamor of a responding pack. Then a far, clear blast of hunting horns out of the sky into the fog. High horns, low horns, silence, and finally a pandemonium of trumpets, rattles, croaks, and cries that almost shakes the bog with its nearness, but without yet disclosing whence it comes. At last, a glint of sun reveals the approach of a great echelon of birds. On motionless wing they emerge from the lifting mists, sweep a final arc of sky, and settle in clangorous descending spirals to their feeding grounds. A new day has begun on the Crane Marsh. A sense of time lies thick and heavy on such a place. Yearly, since the Ice Age, it has awakened each spring to the clangor of cranes. The peat layers that comprise the bog are laid down in the basin of an ancient lake. The cranes stand, as it were, upon the sodden pages of their own history. These peats are the compressed remains of the mosses that clogged the pools, of the tamaracks that spread over the moss, of the cranes that bugled over the tamaracks since the retreat of this ice sheet. An endless caravan of generations has built of its own bones this bridge into the future, this habitat where the oncoming host again may live and breed and die. To what end? Out on the bog, a crane, gulping some luckless frog, springs his ungainly bulk into the air and flails the morning sun with mighty wings. The tamaracks re-echo with his bugled certitude. He seems to know.
Our ability to perceive quality in nature begins, as in art, with the pretty. It expands through successive stages of the beautiful to values as yet uncaptured by language. The quality of cranes lies, I think, in this higher gamut, as yet beyond the reach of words. This much, though, can be said. Our appreciation of the crane grows with the slow unraveling of earthly history. His tribe, we now know, stems out of the remote Eocene. The other members of the fauna in which he originated are long since entombed within the hills. When we hear his call, we hear no mere bird. We hear the trumpet in the orchestra of evolution. He is the symbol of our untamable past, of that incredible sweep of millennia which underlies and conditions the daily affairs of birds and men. And so they live and have their being, these cranes, not in the constricted present, but in the wider reaches of evolutionary time. Their annual return is the ticking of the geologic clock. Upon the place of their return, they confer a peculiar distinction. Amid the endless mediocrity of commonplace, the crane marsh holds a paleontological patent of nobility, one in the march of Ames and revocable only by shotgun. The sadness discernible in some marshes arises, perhaps from their once having harbored cranes. Now they stand humbled, adrift in history. Some sense of this quality in cranes seems to have been felt by sportsmen and ornithologists of all ages. Upon such quarry as this, the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick loosed his gyrfalcons. Upon such quarry as this once swooped the hawks of Kublai Khan. Marco Polo tells us he derives the highest amusement from sporting with gyrfalcons and hawks. At Chanagore, the Khan has a great palace surrounded by a fine plain, where are found cranes in great numbers. He causes millet and other grains to be sown in order that the birds may not want. The ornithologist Bengt Berg, seeing cranes as a boy upon the Swedish heaths, forthwith made them his life work. He followed them to Africa and discovered their winter retreat on the White Nile. He says of his first encounter, it was a spectacle which eclipsed the flight of rock in 1,001 Nights. When the glacier came down out of the north, crunching hills and gouging valleys, some adventuring rampart of ice climbed the Baraboo Hills and fell back into the outlet gorge of the Wisconsin River. The swollen waters backed up and formed a lake half as long as the state, bordered on the east by cliffs of ice and fed by the torrents that fell from melting mountains. The shorelines of this old lake are still visible. Its bottom is the bottom of the Great Marsh. The lake rose through the centuries, finally spilling over east of the Baraboo Range. There it cut a new channel for the river and thus drained itself. To the residual lagoons came the cranes, bugling the defeat of the retreating winter, summoning the on-creeping host of living things to their collective task of marsh building. Floating bogs of sphagnum moss clawed the lower waters, filled them. Sedge and leatherleaf, tamarack and spruce successively advanced over the bog, anchoring it by their root fabric, sucking out its water, making peat. The lagoons disappeared, but not the cranes. To the moss meadows that replaced the ancient waterways they returned each spring to dance and bugle and rear their gangling, sorrel-colored young. These, albeit birds, are not properly called chicks, but colts. I cannot explain why. On some dewy June morning, watch them gambol over their ancestral pastures at the heels of the roan mare, and you will see for yourself.
We're a tag team. One year not long ago, a French trapper in buckskins pushed his canoe up one of the moss-clogged creeks that thread the Great Marsh. At this attempt to invade this miry stronghold, the cranes gave vent to loud and ribald laughter. A century or two later, Englishmen came and covered wagons. They chopped clearings in the timbered moraines that border the marsh, and in them planted corn and buckwheat. They did not intend, like the great Khan at Changanore, to feed the cranes. But the cranes do not question the intent of glaciers, emperors, or pioneers. They ate the grain, and when some irate farmer failed to concede their usufruct in his corn, they trumpeted a warning and sailed across the marsh to another farm. There was no alfalfa in those days, and the hill farms made poor hayland, especially in dry years. One dry year, someone set a fire in the tamaracks. The burn grew up quickly to blue-joined grass, which, when cleared of dead trees, made a dependable hay meadow. After that, each August, men appeared to cut hay. In winter, after the cranes had gone south, they drove wagons over the frozen bogs and hauled the hay to their farms in the hills. Yearly, they plied the marsh with farm, fire, and axe, and in 2 short decades, hay meadows dotted the whole expanse. Each August, when the haymakers came to pitch their camps, singing and drinking and lashing their teams with whip and tongue, the cranes whinnied to their colts and retreated to the far fastnesses. Red shitepotes, the haymakers called them, from the rusty hue made at that season often stains the black battleship gray of crane plumage. After the hay was stacked and the marsh again their own, the cranes returned to call down out of October skies the migrant flocks from Canada. Together they wheeled over the new-cut stubbles and raided the corn until frosts gave the signal for the winter exodus. These hay meadow days were the Arcadian age for marsh dwellers. Man and beast, plant and soil lived on and with each other in mutual toleration, to the mutual benefit of all. The marsh might have kept on producing hay and prairie chickens, deer and muskrat, crane music and cranberries forever. The new overlords did not understand this. They did not include soil, plants, or birds in their idea of mutuality. The dividends of such a balanced economy were too modest. They envisaged farms not only around, but in the marsh. An epidemic of ditch digging and land booming set in. The marsh was gridironed with drainage canals, speckled with new fields and farmsteads.
But crops were poor and beset by frost, to which the expensive ditches added an aftermath of death. Farmers moved out, peat beds dried, shrank, caught fire. Sun energy out of the Pleistocene shrouded the countryside in acrid smoke. No man raised his voice against the waste, only his nose against the smell. After a dry summer, not even the winter snows could extinguish the smoldering marsh. Great pockmarks were burned into field and meadow, the scars reaching down to the sands of the old lake. Peat covered these 100 centuries. Rank weeds sprang out of the ashes to be followed after a year or two by aspen scrub. The cranes were hard put, their numbers shrinking with the remnants of unburned meadow. For them, the song of the power shovel came near being an elegy. The high priest of progress knew nothing of cranes and cared less. What is a species more or less among engineers? What good is an undrained marsh anyhow? For a decade or two, crops grew poorer, fires deeper, woodlands larger, and cranes scarcer, year by year. Only reflooding, it appeared, could keep the peat from burning. Meanwhile, cranberry growers had, by plugging drainage ditches, reflooded a few spots and obtained good yields. Distant politicians bugled about marginal land, overproduction, unemployment relief, conservation. Economists and planners came to look at the marsh. Surveyors, technicians, CCCs buzzed about. A counter-epidemic of reflooding set in. Government bought land, resettled farmers, plugged ditches wholesale. Slowly, the bogs are rewetting. The fire pox became ponds. Grass fires still burn, but they can no longer burn the wetted soil. All this, once the CCC camps were gone, was good for cranes, but not so the thickets of scrub popple that spread inexorably across the old burns, and still less the maze of new roads that inevitably follow governmental conservation. To build a road is so much simpler than to think of what the country really needs. A roadless marsh is seemingly as worthless to the alphabetical conservationist as an undrained one was to the empire builders. Solitude, the one natural resource, still undowered of alphabets, is so far recognized as valuable only by ornithologists and cranes. Thus, always does history, whether of marsh or marketplace, end in paradox. The ultimate value in these marshes is wildness, and the crane is wildness incarnate. But all conservation of wildness is self-defeating, for to cherish we must see and fondle. And when enough have seen and fondled, there is no wilderness left to cherish. Someday, perhaps, in the very process of our benefactions, perhaps in the fullness of geologic time, the last crane will trumpet his farewell and spiral skyward from the great marsh. High out of the clouds will fall the sound of hunting horns, the baying of the phantom pack, the tinkle of little bells, and then a silence never to be broken unless perchance in some far pasture of the Milky Way.
How much of that rang true to you? A lot to be thought of in that elegy. With that, we're going to turn to Kevin, and Kevin's going to bring a couple more, or one more diary entry from the Correspondence Project. So Kevin, bring this back up.
Thanks, Bruce.
I do want to talk about the other aspect.
Yeah, just to preface, hopefully you can join us to check out the exhibit upstairs afterwards. And like Bruce had mentioned, there's a participatory component to it. So I think of art as a expression, but also as a conversation. So really like directly would like to have, and I have a description of sort of looking for, but to have contributions from you guys in helping kind of complete the work as a discussion. So please stick around, and I can follow up a little bit more on that later. And again, thanks also to Bruce and Susan in particular for helping with the reimagining Leopold, be part of Leopold Reads. So also thanks to Kathranne for including me in the Correspondence Project. One reflection on this before I go is I took to kind of to heart the field notes, and it's really hard. This is the second one of these I've done. Surprisingly, to find the time and kind of to get out there and to find the opportunity as you think it might be. Usually days are very busy, and so I was rushing around a lot trying to get these things in. One, I apologize for typos and kind of garbled thinking and typing in my writing. I didn't think I'd be reading one in the future anywhere. There is a drawing on a work from Leopold, the farmer's conservationist, which I guess is kind of a B-side, certainly to the Sand County Almanac, but I found it very rewarding. And one of the other just kind of themes that came up prior is, in the writing is sort of this law of diminishing returns that you mentioned that was also exploring. So with that, this is the Oberg Mountain Loop. It's on July 7th at 3:40 in Tofty, Minnesota. Hiking on the north shore of Lake Superior, I came across this plant with white berries I was familiar with prior. It was I should have been unfamiliar with. It was a white baneberry. As nearly as I can tell. The plant, along with the red baneberry, is highly toxic, and as little as 6 berries, if ingested, will cause serious issues. I'm usually amazed at how much is edible, but we have no interest or knowledge in eating. And I'm skipping this kind of double part. But my thing was, again, just to kind of discover, like, it's really beautiful and interesting, and usually those things are actually inedible. The North Shore attracts people for the outdoors. I am one of them. But at the same time, I also feel that it feeds our misguided notions of ecology as something that we keep a bit here and there, unless there is more profit to be made, and go visit like an elderly relative on occasion. We decide to save the land that has characteristics we find rare, visually arresting, and easily put into recreational service. We need a more mature relationship to our environment, Leopold wrote. All I'm saying is there is drama in every bush if you can see it. The system we have is similar in that we have such limited vision and capacity for what is possible. Many have steered us to believe agriculture is a never-ending quest for higher efficiency and higher yields. It is nature redesigned for the market. Yet what is the eventual outcome?
At what point is efficiency and yield high enough? Then what? It is ironic that the ideology of feed the world is aligned with the expectation that everyone should feed themselves. Of course, never mind to what extent the crops are being used to feed people. Leopold was referencing a particular bush called the bog birch. I don't have my sketch to work on. He describes it as a commonly overlooked, unappreciated plant, but one that is a matter of life and death for many species. Our focus is elsewhere, so these things we do not know about do not matter. We need an ecology version of the Antiques Roadshow, in which many people start to realize what they might have locked up, given away, or thrown away is actually perhaps of some value, or even a treasure worthy of a museum. On the roadshow, once people realize what they have is of far more value than they imagine, suddenly they have a new relationship and a plan for caring for it than they did prior. We need to be more skeptical and question what system we have and what is being promoted by whom. We need to be looking outside the current system for other ideas and options. Some of these ideas are old ones we have had for a long time, but are typically ignored, locked up, or tossed out as we don't realize their value or potential.
Thank you, Kevin. We have another little break before we go into the last segment on land ethics, so by all means help yourself to your refreshments in the back. As I pause here, and this is a comment or a concept or the impact from Marsh Elegy I thought was interesting. It says, Leopold's sobering message asks us to consider how we can protect and cherish something at the same time. He warns that beyond the impacts we make when we degrade land in multiple ways, the act of admiring nature can have impacts of its own. And in some of the discussion questions related to marshland elegy especially, it talks about one question I thought was very appropriate for having the exhibit upstairs is, in art appreciation, your understanding and knowledge increases as you learn more about the techniques and mediums used by impressionist painters or sculptors. Have you ever seen anything so beautiful that you weren't able to describe it adequately with words? I think that's what Kevin, when he's trying to describe what he was seeing up on the North Lake Shore, was struggling with, and how you describe that in words. So can the process of appreciating nature be compared to appreciating art? So for our artist friends that are here today, I think there is a strong correlation between the two. If we can appreciate nature's wonder and the art that is around us all the time, it's like appreciating a fine piece of art as well. So as we kind of move into our third segment here, I might give you this question to ponder. Can you think of ways that people can appreciate and understand parts of the natural world without unintentionally destroying them? I think that's a challenge we all live with in this day and age, where we are trying to balance what we want to cherish, but yet at the same time, back to the question on what's economic, we try to put economic value on everything, and sometimes it's very difficult to do that. Yes?
Some sort of basic questions. I don't understand exactly what nature is. You know, we were thrown out of the garden, and most of the things that happen now are by our choice, or neglect, or somehow are human. Mm-hmm. And it seems, I mean, we can say some things are beautiful and some things aren't, but is there other ways of defining what nature is?
I'll throw that back to the group as large, because I'm not sure I'm capable of answering that question. Nature, in my mind, I guess, is, you're right, that as humans, we've been placed on this earth, that we tend to think, and I think we'll get into this more as we get into this third segment on land ethic, and the ethics of us with the natural world, that we have a responsibility of how do we care for our natural resources. Is it for our own means or use only, or is it for the broader sense of community? there's a lot of ethical questions that go along with that. Herb, you want to take a shot at answering her question?
Well, nature is all around us, and you can say the grass is growing in a crack in the concrete is nature.
Right.
Nature is the weather. Nature is our climate. It's everything that we experience, I think, in our interactions with the earth. And but ecologists tend to think of it as undisturbed areas that are self-sufficient, that reproduce itself over time, may change over time, but nevertheless are there to replenish themselves for generations. So, it's hard to define. I agree with you, Deb. But it's something that we experience, I think, as humans, and we have to think of ourselves as part of that nature, as part of that community of living things. We're the only planet, as far as we know, in the universe that has living things as we know it. So, are we going to maintain it, or are we going to destroy it? That's a big question. I'd like to make one comment about the marshland elegy. When Leopold wrote that was really some time before he wrote Sand County Almanac. He believed that the marshes were going to be drained and the cranes were going to disappear from Wisconsin. He was writing an elegy to the demise of the cranes. But in 1935, he wrote the first book on wildlife management. And wildlife management became a profession that I was proud to be part of during my career. And wildlife management actually brought back the cranes to Wisconsin and preserved the marshes. And now we have whooping cranes in Wisconsin, nesting. And so I think you have to realize that Leopold had a great impact not only on his appreciation and his land ethic, but also the fact that he actually provided the tools by which we can preserve some of these things.
I was going to suggest, Michael Pollan's introduction to Botany of Desire, where he talks about, brings the human and the bee in that process and brings it very much into the kind of one and the same. It's very interesting, kind of get leads into what is nature and how are we within it or outside of it or not.
Any other reactions?
I think to that question, and it doesn't sound very good to answer it this way, but the way I look at it more objectively is that it's pretty obvious that humans need nature and nature does not need us. And that it existed probably a lot longer than when we got here. But it's almost like in the last several centuries, at least, probably several hundred centuries, is that humanity is getting more insane as it goes along. And what we do is just ridiculous and destructive, and it's like they're blind to it. We can't see others what we can see here. And it's getting to the point, I think, where nature, and if you want to believe in nature's God, some creator, has decided that humanity is just no longer any use, and is slowly taking us out. And eventually, by the end of the century, there won't be a lot of humans around because you destroyed our environment. And once we're gone, the earth will heal itself in who knows how many years, centuries, or millennium, and it'll return back to where it was. And there'll be new birds and new kinds of fish and all that used to be gone in species, and it'll just renew itself, and it doesn't need human beings. We're like an add-on or a plug-in to a computer program. It doesn't need us. So I think it's really, we finally got to the point where we're the maximum insanity.
Rather a dour expression, I would say, as far as our predictability of what's will happen in the future. But I think that's why we have these discussions, is that I think humans are, and I think Leopold would recognize that we are part of the community, that we are just one part of the world around us, and we can choose to be additive or subtractive to it. But I think that's what he's trying to get across, and that leads us into our next segment of our program, about on time with, is talking about ethics and talking about Leopold's land ethic. And introduction to the concept of ethics. Ethics provide context for our individual actions relative to larger social values. Leopold understood that ultimately the health of land and in turn human health will be determined by people's values. Sand County Almanac ends with Leopold's challenge to individuals and communities to join in the intellectual and emotional evolution of a land ethic. So with that, I'm going to return it back to Kevin to read another segment for the Correspondence Project, which is interesting, I think. Well, before we do that, there are some tickets in here. Sorry, Kevin, sorry. Fred will give away a Sand County Almanac. If somebody in here does not have a copy of Sand County Almanac. Mary Lou Nelson. Okay. And I'll pick one more. Gina Folsom. Okay, well, if you have not filled out a ticket and you would like a copy, you have a really good opportunity to get a copy of Sand County Almanac. So you'll have another opportunity towards the end. I also failed to mention that the correspondence essays that were, if you didn't recognize it, they are printed in your program, so you can follow along there. The one that Kevin just read prior to the break was pretty lengthy, and I didn't try to get it all up on the screen. So Kevin, I'll bring you back now.
So just to conclude on the participation in the Correspondence Project, one, I think we're due for another one, because when they were hard to do, like during the week, you're like, oh, I gotta get that done. And then once it stopped after the week, I was like, oh, I don't want to write, I don't want to keep going. And it was over. So for this other reading, just one thing that came to mind and was mentioned at the beginning that I think Irv said that Leopold was more a standard than a person, and Kathranne said that the Leopold Center and the need to support science and research, it's more than that. One of the PhD students that actually reached out and kind of initiated the Reimagining Leopold exhibit, David Weisberger, when we were talking to him, and it's like, why, what is the World Leopold Center, and how do you feel about all this? And he finally, said it was a safe space. So I think that it represents, just in the way that Leopold represents something more, the Leopold Center and its importance and its role is more than just the kind of like a research center. It does a lot more than that. This reading, Mainframe Studios by from Lee Emma Running. I was at the Mainframe Studios in Design for my dissertation exhibition. I was listening to one of my friends' poster review, and he was talking about censorship and controlling the information and its impact on health and well-being. I looked at the window and I faced this landscape, the hills trapped in concrete surface. For one moment, it was like the built environment is censoring the natural landscape. However, I know we always need to touch and change our environment, and this is all the creatures would do. I think again the question is, what is the ethic of change, and who needs to have the power to control the change? and who should benefit from the change, just like controlling the information.
Kevin? Our next speaker is Chris Morris. Chris is a graduate student in the Sustainable Agriculture Department at the Sustainable Agriculture Graduate Program at Iowa State. And Chris and I have a little bit of a similar background in that we both worked for the Natural Resources Conservation Service, I for many years. Chris worked for a number of years and decided to see the light and go back to school. So we welcome Chris to be here. He said he was a very passionate Aldo Leopold follower, and he was extremely excited about reading about the part of the land ethic. So Chris, I'll let you introduce the go from there.
Good afternoon. A Sand County Almanac was a major influence on me going into my career as a conservationist. I've worked for the NRCS down in Texas for 15 years as a conservation planner, and the Leopold Center was one of the main reasons that I chose Iowa State to come back and work on my master's. So I'm honored to be here with all of you today reading some of Leopold's words. So I'll be reading a selection from his famous essay, The Land Ethic, and this is called The Ecological Conscience. Conservation is a state of harmony between men and land. Despite nearly a century of propaganda, conservation still proceeds at a snail's pace. Progress still consists largely of letterhead, pieties, and convention oratory. On the back 40, we still slip 2 steps backward for each forward stride. The usual answer to this dilemma is more conservation education. No one will debate this, but it is certain that only the volume of education needs stepping up, is something lacking in the content as well. It is difficult to give a fair summary of its content in brief form, but as I understand it, the content is substantially this: obey the law, vote right, join some organizations, and practice what conservation is profitable on your own land. The government will do the rest. Is not this formula too easy to accomplish anything worthwhile? It defines no right or wrong, assigns no obligation, calls for no sacrifice, implies no change in the current philosophy of values. In respect of land use, it urges only enlightened self-interest. Just how far will such education take us? An example will perhaps yield a partial answer. By 1930, it had become clear to all except the ecologically blind that southwestern Wisconsin's topsoil was slipping seaward. In 1933, the farmers were told that if they would adopt certain remedial practices for 5 years, the public would donate CC labor to install them, plus the necessary machinery and materials. The offer was widely accepted, but the practices were widely forgotten when the 5-year contract period was up. The farmers continued only those practices that yielded an immediate and visible economic gain for themselves. This led to the idea that maybe farmers would learn more quickly if they themselves wrote the rules. Accordingly, the Wisconsin legislature in 1937 passed the Soil Conservation District Law. This said to farmers, in effect, we the public will furnish you free technical service and loan you specialized machinery if you will write your own rules for land use. Each county may write its own rules, and these will have the force of law. Nearly all the counties promptly organized to accept the proffered help, but after a decade of operation, no county has yet written a single rule. There has been visible progress in such practices as strip cropping, pasture renovation, and soil liming, but none in fencing woodlots against grazing, and none in excluding plow and cow from steep slopes. The farmers, in short, have selected those remedial practices which were profitable anyhow, and ignored those which were profitable to the community, but not clearly profitable to themselves. When one asks why no rules have been written, one is told that the community is not yet ready to support them. Education must precede rules. But the education actually in progress makes no mention of obligations to land over and above those dictated by self-interest. The net result is that we have more education but less soil, fewer healthy woods, and as many floods as in 1937. The puzzling aspect of such situations is that the existence of obligations over and above self-interest is taken for granted in such rural community enterprises as the betterment of roads, schools, churches, and baseball teams. Their existence is not taken for granted, nor as yet seriously discussed in bettering the behavior of the water that falls on the land, or in the preserving of the beauty or diversity of the farm landscape. Land use ethics are still governed wholly by economic self-interest, just as social ethics were a century ago. To sum up, we asked the farmer to do what he conveniently could to save his soil, and he has done just that, and only that. The farmer who clears the woods off a 75% slope, turns his cows into the clearing, and dumps its rainfall, rocks, and soil into the community creek is still, if otherwise decent, a respected member of society. If he puts lime on his fields and plants his crops on contour, he is still entitled to all the privileges and emoluments of his soil conservation district. The district is a beautiful piece of social machinery, but it is coughing along on 2 cylinders because we have been too timid and too anxious for quick success to tell the farmer the true magnitude of his obligations. Obligations have no meaning without conscience. And this problem we face is the extension of the social conscience from people to land. No important change in ethics was ever accomplished without an internal change in our intellectual emphasis, loyalties, affections, and convictions. The proof that conservation has not yet touched these foundations of conduct lies in the fact that philosophy and religion have not yet heard of it. In our attempt to make conservation easy, we have made it trivial. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. There's a lot of that I reflect on for 40 years of working with the NRCS and conservation districts. Some of it rings very true. But there's a lot that we have made progress. We shouldn't be catty about it. Conservation districts have done a lot of good work. But Leopold, I had to laugh when I read that the first time. That he had a certain definite opinion about the conservation district law at the time. It reminds me a little bit of the 1973, 4, somewhere in that, the soil loss law that was passed here in Iowa that gave the soil conservation districts the power to inflict injury on a landowner who exceeded the soil loss limits. However, it depended upon a complaint being filed by his neighbor, which got to be rather interesting sometimes. So conservation district couldn't go out and say you're losing too much soil, but you had to wait for the neighbor to tell them that you complain that they lose too much soil. So I'm going to end the slideshow part right now because we're going to move into a segment with Clark that is also printed in your program. This starts with solutions. So you can follow along with that because we're going to bounce around from several different parts of the land ethic. And again, thanks to Jerry for kind of melding this together and for Clark to interpret it. But most of it's coming from the land ethic. There's one part of it that comes out of a book that's on my own copy on the back table for the health of the land. A small segment comes from that as well. So with that, Clark Wolf is going to be our next speaker. And Clark, thanks again for being here. We worked for us last year, and we're glad to have you back.
So like other speakers, I first encountered the Sand County Almanac and Aldo Leopold in class. But I took at Oberlin College ages ago from Norman Kerr, who's my philosophy professor, and I'm now the philosophy professor who assigns my students to read this every year. So, my students will all, both my classes will be reading Leopold in the fall. One of the things that Mary read from Leopold. Let's see if I can find from Marshland Elegy. It was the thought that, oh, I had it marked, but I just removed my mark, so I'm gonna no, he says that for many of us, our first encounter with nature is the pretty, right? And I think for many of us, the first encounter with Leopold is the prettiness, right? I mean, it's elegant, lovely prose, right? But I think one of the things that I would note is that the reason Mozart lasted and Von Hall didn't, right, is that Mozart, they're both pretty, but for Mozart there are bones down there that give it structure and real depth. And the same is true of Leopold. There's real depth in this work, and that's why I think it's, I mean, I teach philosophy, so I teach material that was written 2,500 years ago. You know, this is really young. This is really recent stuff. So the question, you know, why are we still reading Leopold after all this time? It doesn't seem like that long to me. But the answer that I would give is that this is truly great material, and this is truly material that has some depth. And I'm really glad to get to read the parts that I read here, because I think they are some of the segments of this book that have depth. And by that, I don't mean to diminish the other parts of the book, because I think if you listen to other things that we've heard today, you'll hear in Marshland Elegy and other aspects, other parts of this book, sort of shot through with the depth of thought that Leopold couldn't help but imbue in everything that he touched, everything that he wrote about. So I'm going to start with a section from the land ethic. I do want to think, though, a little bit about the question, you know, what is nature? Question that didn't get an answer. I address it in my class, but I'm a philosopher, so I don't tell the answer either, right? You don't get answers. But there are a lot. One of the problems is that there's no satisfactory answer. I do think that Leopold has a view about that question. Right? Leopold talks about nature, and he talks about the difference between an attitude toward the natural world, where we might feel ourselves as lords and masters who can structure and shape the world around us, versus the attitude of plain member citizens of the biotic community, right, which is a different attitude. But when you read Leopold, he doesn't make a sharp distinction between humanity and nature. He thinks that humanity has stepped outside of its biotic role, but it doesn't mean that we're not natural. It doesn't mean that human creations are not natural in some interesting sense. It means that we're destroying something that's crucial and valuable, and we need to think about how to stop doing that, right? So, because I think that question has never been more pressing than it is now, I fear that it will be more pressing for the next generation, even than it is for us. I think that's one of the reasons Leopold has this enduring value for us, and will be, you know, on the schedule in philosophy classes like mine forever, like Plato, right? It's not going to disappear. So I'm going to start with a section from the land ethic called the upshot. All ethics so far evolved rest on a simple, single premise, that the individual is a member of a community of interdependent parts. His instincts prompt him to compete for his place in that community, but his ethics prompt him to also to cooperate, perhaps in order that there may be a place to compete for. The land ethic simply enlarges the boundaries of the community to include soils, waters, plants, and animals, or collectively, the land. This sounds simple. Don't we already sing our love for obligation to the land of the free and the home of the brave? Well, yes, but just who and for whom do we love? Certainly not the soil, which we're sending helter-skelter downriver. Certainly not the waters, which we assume have no function except to turn turbines or float barges and carry off sewage. Certainly not the plants, of which we exterminate whole communities without batting an eye. Certainly not the animals, of which we've already extirpated many of the largest and most beautiful species. A land ethic, of course, can't prevent the alteration, management, and use of these resources. Leopold scare quotes there around resources. But it does affirm their right to continued existence, and at least in spots, their continued existence in a natural state. In short, a land ethic changes the role of Homo sapiens from conqueror of the land community to plain member and citizen of it. It implies respect for his fellow members and also respect for the community as such. In human history, we've learned, I hope, that the conqueror role is eventually self-defeating. Why? Because it's implicit in such a role that the conqueror knows, ex cathedra, just what makes the community clock tick, just what and who is valuable, and what and who is worthless in community life. It always turns out that he knows neither one, and that's why his conquests eventually defeat themselves. Skipping over, this is a section from another section called The Substitutes for a Land Ethic. One basic weakness in a conservation system based wholly on economic motives. By the way, when he's thinking of substitutes for a land ethic, he's thinking about the land ethic that he's just painted out there, right? And he's thinking of alternatives. So the alternative he's considering here is an ethic based on self-interest, which we also heard in Chris's remarks, right? The idea of economic incentives for conservation taking the place of an ethic. So one basic weakness in a conservation system based wholly on economic motives, writes Leopold, is that most members in the land community have no economic value. Wildflowers, songbirds are examples of the 22,000 higher plants and animals native to Wisconsin. It's doubtful whether more than 5% can be sold, fed, eaten, or otherwise put to economic use. Yet these creatures are members of the biotic community, and if, as I believe, its stability depends on its integrity, they are entitled to continuance. A system of conservation based solely on economic self-interest is hopelessly lopsided. It tends to ignore, and thus eventually to eliminate, many elements in the land community that lack commercial value, but that are, as far as we know, essential to its healthy functioning. It assumes falsely, I think, that the economic parts of the biotic clock will function without the uneconomic parts. It tends to relegate to government many functions eventually too large, too complex, or too widely dispersed to be performed by government. An ethical obligation on the part of the private owner is the only visible remedy for these situations. And now for the health of the land. What are the probable conditions requisite for the perpetuation of the biotic self-renewal or land health? This would define a goal for conservationists to strive toward. They now have no basic goal bracketing all component groups. Each group has its own goal, has its own common knowledge that these conflicts conflict and nullify each other to a large degree. I will record my own guess about probable conditions for biotic self-renewal. The biotic clock may continue ticking if we cease throwing away its parts, if we handle it gently, if we recognize that its importance transcends economics, and if we don't let too many people tinker with it. Back to Sand County Almanac. This is also from the Outlook, and this is maybe one of the most famous sections of all. The case for a land ethic would appear hopeless, but for a minority which is in obvious revolt against these modern trends. The key log which must be removed to release the evolutionary process for an ethic is simply this. Actually, I have to stop here, because you may not know what a key log is, right? When they cut down the great forests of North America, they floated all the logs down the river. So Lake Nipigon was full of logs from north that were flowing down Nipigon, and every so often the logs would jam up in a log jam. You've heard the term log jam, but log jams were real things when they harvested North America's ancient forests, which happened all at once, right? It's one of the most amazing instances of environmental change. So a log jam is a dam that blocks the river and ceases the flow of logs down river to the sawmill. And when they had a log jam, people actually walked out on that dam and wiggled the logs to try to get them to move, which was a very dangerous thing, and people died doing it. The key log was the log that you moved that sent the whole thing sluicing down the river again, right? So according to Leopold, ethics, philosophical ethics, my field has been constipated, like a river that's jammed up behind a log dam. And there's something that needs to be moved before we can move to the next level of thought. I regret the analogy I made there. That was not particular, but it sort of fits. So according to Leopold, ethics has been constrained, right? We're blinded by something, and something has to move before that change in consciousness can take place. So I'm going to go back here for a minute. The key log which must be moved to release the evolutionary process for an ethic is simply this. Quit thinking about land use as solely an economic problem. Examine each question in terms of what is ethically and aesthetically right, as well as what is economically expedient. A thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. It's wrong when it tends otherwise. I have to read that again, because that is, in some sense, one of the most philosophically interesting sentences in this important book, right? A thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community, and it's wrong when it tends otherwise. It, of course, goes without saying that economic feasibility limits the tether of what can or cannot be done for land. It always has, and it always will. The fallacy of the economic determinists have tied around our connective neck, and which we now need to cast off, is the belief that economics determines all land use. This is simply not true. An innumerable host of actions and attitudes, comprising perhaps the bulk of all land relations, is determined by land users' tastes and predilections, rather than his purse. The bulk of all land relations hinges on an investment of time, forethought, skill, and faith, rather than on investments of cash. As a land user thinketh, so is he. The evolution of a land ethic is an intellectual as well as an emotional process. Conservation is paved with good intentions, which prove to be futile or even dangerous, because they're devoid of critical understanding either of the land or economic land use. I think it's a truism that as the ethical frontier advances from the individual to the community, its intellectual content increases. The mechanism of operation is the same for any ethic. Social approbation for right actions, social disapproval for wrong actions. By and large, our present problem is one of attitudes and influence. We are remodeling the Alhambra with a steam shovel. We're proud of our yardage, and we shall hardly relinquish the shovel, which after all has many good points. But we are in need of gentler and more objective criteria for its successful use.
Thank you, Clark. A challenging task to do very well. Let's try to integrate that all together. So, a lot there to ponder. A lot. I'm going to just go ahead and call Fred up to kind of help us wrap up. Fred Kirschman is, who all of you probably know, is a distinguished fellow at the Leopold Center, Leopold Center for Sustainable Agriculture, past director of that center, and he gave Fred the challenge of a little 2019 outlook and try to take some quotes that Kurt Mine had given us about Leopold and maybe how he might be thinking towards climate change and some of our current issues. So I'm not just sure where Fred's going with this, but we'll find out. So.
Well, thank you very much. And I am really appreciative of Jerry and I think Dennis Keeney and others who contacted Kurt Miney, who, as you all know, was a great biographer of Leopold, to ask him if he could select some quotes that Leopold had that addressed the climate change issue. And so he did that, and most of what I'm going to present are the quotes that he provided for us in his. One of the things that Kurt said at the beginning was that we should not be surprised if there isn't a lot about climate change in Leopold's writing specifically, because climate change science was just in the very early stages of beginning at that point. But, as we've already heard, the kind of vision which Leopold had for how we should relate to the Earth is what we need to do if we're actually going to address climate change, at least from my perspective. So here are some of the quotes that Kurt Miney selected. It said, possibly in our intuitive perceptions, which may be truer than our science and less impeded by words than our philosophies, we realize the indivisibility of the Earth, its soil, mountains, rivers, forests, climate, he does mention climate, plants and animals, and respect it collectively not only as a useful servant, but as living beings vastly less alive than ourselves in degree, but vastly greater than ourselves in time and space, as being that was old when the morning stars sang together, and when the last of us had been gathered unto his fathers, we still be young. The time has come for science to busy itself with Earth itself. This first step is to reconstruct a sample of what we had to start with. We inherit the Earth, but within limits of the soil and plant succession, we also rebuild the Earth without plan, without knowledge of its properties, and without understanding of the increasingly coarse of powerful tools which science has placed at our disposal. The privilege of possessing the Earth entails the responsibility of passing it on, the better for our use, not only to immediate posterity, but to the unknown future, the nature of which not has given us to know. In other words, Leopold's view here was that we're not going to be able to predict anything and understand where things are going, but it's what our participation in it is going to be that we have to pay attention to. Many of the world's most penetrating minds have regarded our so-called inanimate nature as a living thing, and probably many of us who have neither the time nor the ability to reason out conclusions on such matters, biological processes, have felt intuitively that there existed between man and Earth a closer and deeper relation than would necessarily follow the mechanistic conception of the Earth as our physical provider and abiding place. And to me, that's one of the key cultural kinds of issues that we're going to have to address. That we tend to look at nature as something that we own, that we have to control, that we have to make do what we want to do, instead of learning from nature and recognizing that we're a part of it. For 20 centuries and longer, all civilized thought has rested upon one basic premise. That is, the destiny of man to exploit and enslave the Earth. However, a new science called ecology has been unobtrusively spreading a film of doubt over this heretofore unchallenged worldview. Ecology tells us that no animal, not even man, can be regarded as independent of his environment. And these, again, are some of the basic key issues that we're actually going to deal with climate change in a meaningful way that we have to come to terms with. And then another quote that he selected was, conservation is the state of harmony between men and land, but land is meant all of the things on, over, or in the Earth. And again, land is not just something that we own and occupy, it's really what the whole of Earth is about. Evolutionary changes are usually slow and local. Man's invention of tools has enabled him to make changes of unprecedented violence, rapidity, and scope. The impending industrialization of the world, now foreseen by everyone, means that many conservation problems heretofore local will shortly become global. So in other words, conservation issues aren't just dealing with what we've got close to us, it's really a global issue now that determines how we relate to the earth and therefore how the earth is going to be available to us in the future. There is value in any experience that reminds us of our dependency of the soil, plant, animal, man, food chain, and to the fundamental organization of the biota. And here again is one of those key issues of Leopold's that I think is critical if we want to seriously deal with climate change, and that is the interdependence of the whole biota. In other words, we're not going to deal with climate change if we just change our light bulbs or, do one thing or another. We have to really begin to see how the earth is an interdependent biota of which we are a part. Civilization has so cluttered this elemental man-earth relation with gadgets and middlemen that awareness of its growing dim, we fancy that industry supports us, forgetting what supports industry, which I thought was one of the key kinds of statements that we really, again, need to incorporate into our thinking. And then finally, the general theme to keep in mind is that we are challenged to extend the land ethic to become an earth ethic, one that addresses our relationship at all scales, from our local landscapes to global issues of climate, soils, water, biodiversity, etc. And again, Leopold, even back then, included climate as a part of this issue, while linking them to the health of our human social systems. Now, I think that, and Irv quoted this earlier today, but to me, one of the key comments that Leopold included in the foreword to the Sand County Almanac was when he said, "We abuse land because we regard it as a commodity belonging to us. We may begin to use it when we see land as a community to which we belong, we begin to use it with love and respect." And I think that's one of the basic cultural shifts, that we're going to have to include into our culture if we're going to fundamentally deal with climate change. Now, I want to just, one other quote, which is one of my favorites in Leopold's writings, but I think is also critical as we think about these issues. And I think I'm going to make a case at least that there's a little bit of basis for good news in this. And that is for the health of the land. This is part of the outlook for farm wildlife. And near the end of that, he makes this statement: "It was inevitable and no doubt desirable that the tremendous momentum of industrialization should have spread to farm life. It is clear to me, however," he wrote, "that it has overshot the mark in the sense that it is generating new insecurities, economic and ecological, in place of those that it was meant to abolish. In its extreme form, it is humbly desolate, humanly desolate, and economically unstable. These extremes will someday die of their own too much, not because they're bad for wildlife, but because they're bad for the farmers." Now, the reason that awareness of his already back in the 1930s, 1940s, was that that's now actually beginning to become a reality. And if you haven't had a chance to look at David Montgomery's new book, Growing a Revolution, in which, based on his research and spending time on 8 farms, most of them right here in the Great Plains, only one organic farm, a Rodale Institute, all the others are conventional farms. But these are all farmers that he spent time with. who began to recognize this input-intensive system, which is part of this industrial agriculture, the core piece of the industrial agriculture, that they were losing money. Why? Because their input costs kept going up, the returns kept going down, and so they just weren't making money anymore. So they knew they had to do something different. And so each of them, in their own way, did three things. They reduced their tillage, they include cover crops, which of course helped to restore the health of soil, and they began to significantly increase the biological diversity so that the biological dynamics of the system reduced their costs, and all of them now are beginning to make money. And he claims that every one of these farmers, based on his research now, are no longer interested in getting bigger, because that's not the solution to anything. What they're interested in is further finding the biological dynamics which reduce their costs and enable them to make a profit. Now, 8 farms is a very small piece, right? But it's a beginning without anybody going to the farmers and saying, hey, you got to do something different. I mean, they're discovering this old, and then they try to find out what they could do. And the subtitle of David Montgomery's book is Bringing Soil Back to Life. That is what we're beginning to see now. And if somebody had told me 4 or 5 years ago that someday soil health would become a key issue, I would have said, I don't think so. But now, soil health is almost in everybody's literature that has anything to do with soil. So again, we're beginning to make some progress here. Now, the big challenge, and as you all know, the most recent IPCC report said that in terms of climate change, we only have about 12 years to make these significant changes of the kind that Leopold talked about, if we're going to have, if climate change is not going to become catastrophic. Now, 12 years is not a long time, and so we have a short period of time in which to make these changes, and that's the reason now that I think that Leopold's writings are more important now than they ever have been since they've been written, because this is it's his vision and his way of thinking ecologically, and that this can be done on a practical basis is really the basis of the kinds of changes that we have to make. And so I think that not only the Sand County Almanac, but for the health of the land and other writings like those that Kurt Miney provided to us are the kinds of things that we need to really incorporate into our culture, because it's a cultural shift that we have to make now.
Thanks, Brad. Yeah, we're going to take just a few minutes to, Fred, why don't you stay there for a second? And if you have any reactions to what Fred talked about or what Clark discussed in the different segments of the land ethic and what Chris discussed on ecological conscious, let's talk about that now. Yes.
It's 11 years now.
It's on. Okay.
Why don't we go ahead and use the mic?
Okay.
I think it's 11 years now. We kind of lost one to 2030. But I've done work in rural Denmark, and that's kind of where I came across, some of these issues. But the concept of ownership there is so much different. When we stole the land from the Indians, who had a different land ethic in this country, it was all that this land is my land and I can do whatever I want on this land and nobody can tell me what to do. And this ethic is very, very different in Europe, for example. And I just want to submit that as what we think the bundle of rights that we connect with land ownership in this country is really not healthy.
Yeah, you're exactly right, and one of the key, well, there's a couple of issues in this that I think we have to pay attention to. One is, first of all, we have to pay attention to the kind of culture that we've instilled in our farmers here in this country. And that is, they had to get big or get out, they had to farm fence row to fence row, and if they were going to be successful, they had to develop the system to do this, and of course what they did was huge specialized monocultures. and expand their farms as much as possible. Now, where we are today is that, most of our farms now are well over 500 acres, many of them over 1,000 acres. And the age of our farmers, because we also told them to get big or get out, and so if they couldn't get big, they got out. And so the age of our farmers now is almost 60, average age almost 60, and I think it's like 30% are over age 70. Now, if you put yourself in the place of a farmer who did exactly what we all told him that he or she needed to do, and they've done that, and now they're in their 70s, and we say, wait a minute, you ought to make these changes. That's probably not going to work very well. Now, to me, again, the good news, and I have the opportunity, especially in my work with the Stone Barn Center in New York, of working with the millennial generation. And as far as I know, nobody's done really a research to determine what the percentage of the millennial generation is that's moving in this new direction. But I think, based on my own experience, we're close to 20%. And they are not interested in raiding monoculture commodities. They want to raise food for people, and they want that relationship. Now, the other thing that is important in terms of the world, and Timothy Weiss made this point in research that he did, I think back in the 1970s now, he pointed out that 70% of the world's people are fed by farmers farming 5 acres or less. It's not the big farms which are feeding, commercial farms that are feeding the world. It's smaller farms in communities who are providing food for people in most of the world. Now, that's not to say that the commercial farms are still dominating, especially in the United States. But again, given David Montgomery's work, where they're starting to lose money, I think we have the opportunity to make these shifts in a relatively short period of time. But we have to create the social and ecological, sense about why this is important, and also, and this is where I think, what I'm most regretful about the Leopold Center losing its funding is because right now the Leopold Center should be doing the kind of research that points and really asks the question, where are we going to be 20 or 30 years from now, and how do we get there? And the good news is that there are some farmers in here, even here in Iowa, who are already moving or have already moved in that direction. And we need to feature them and help, especially the young farmers coming in, that they don't have to just raise 1,000 acres of corn and soybeans, that there are other opportunities and they can be financially successful at it. And again, part of my passion now is not only to restore the Leopold Center, but also to create collaborative relationships with other organizations, especially in the United States, that also are interested in doing this, so that we can begin to create national and even international movement. And the Center for Science and the Public Interest is one organization that's very interested in doing that and being a part of that, and there are others as well. So again, there's a lot of opportunity, there's a lot of work, and there's a cultural shift that we all need to work on. And it's one of the reasons that meetings like this, I think, are so important, because that cultural shift is really critical.
Just a note for many here that might be interested, I just received word that Bill Stowe has died, the director of the Des Moines Water Works.
So Leopold calls for a cultural shift, as you've called for. And I'm wondering about that, because it seems to me that it's hard to affect cultural shift, and it takes a long time we live in a pluralistic culture. We're not all about to become Christians or Buddhists. We're not all about to become adherents to any of the great doctrines. And when I think about Leopold's land ethic, it's a doctrine like that, the cultural shift that would be required to accomplish a change in our national culture, let alone our global culture, to make us adherents of a land ethic, strike me as unlikely.
Yeah.
And that's the first part of what I want to say. The second part, and it's quick, is that I do think also Leopold may underestimate the importance of policy, the importance of global. I think to solve the problem of climate, we can't become evangelists for the land ethic merely, right? We also need to work to get an international agreement that will change the way the world is consuming fossil fuels and producing CO2. And I think when I look at it, cultural shift is important. It's crucial. I'm a believer. I'm a true believer.
Yeah,
right?
I totally agree with you about the concept, and I don't agree about how the changes and the cultural shifts take place. I don't think it's a matter of how we convince people that they should change the culture. That's not going to be successful. What it is how are we going to adapt to the changes that are going to come at us? Because that's what's going to happen. And if you just think about, Ugo Bardi, an Italian scientist, wrote this book, Extracted, where he points out all of the inputs that we've developed and are used to that we're depleting, we're extracting them. And once they're gone, how are we going to do things? We can't do them that way anymore. But if you think about it just in terms of agriculture, and say even here in Iowa, at some point, crude oil will become $300 a barrel, because we're depleting those resources, and the more we deplete them, and we up to now, it's only a few cents of change in the price of gasoline, but nevertheless, it's going to continue moving in that direction. So if crude oil is $300 a barrel, and rock phosphates are, say, $2,500 a ton and $700 a ton, because there are only 4 countries that still have rock phosphate reserves, and that's the resource from which we get our phosphorus, so we're not going to have that. And then we're depleting our fresh water resources all across the planet. And of course, the more that we lose the health of our soil, the more we're going to need irrigation water. And if that becomes so expensive, it's not going to take me or you or anybody else telling farmers that they should change. They're going to say, how do we farm under these kinds of circumstances? And that's what we need. And this is why I think that the notion of anticipating the changes coming at us and how do we get a head start preparing for them, and getting that head start preparing for them is, from my view, what some of the more creative people like David Montgomery and others are really pointing out, and encouraging farmers to at least give that some thought.
It sounds to me like we have kind of 2 developments going at the same time that you're both pointing out. I'm sorry. One, on one hand, David Montgomery, who, the way, at least you've presented it, and I haven't read his book yet, but it's an economic equation. And I did hear him speak, and I think that he's thinking beyond just pure economics. And yet, what he's proposing, the appeal to conventional farmers, you don't have to be, a tree hugger, you don't have to be an ecologist. You have to be a farmer who's making good common sense decisions. So that's happening at the same time. There maybe is a certain number of people who are making that kind of cultural decision that I want to be a part of a community, that this is something that I want. We've seen what the sort of industrialization of farming has brought us. So there's 2 things happening at the same time, it looks like. I'm just saying, maybe the combination of those things, because it's not going to be just one or the other that's going to, we need it all.
Yeah, and I wasn't trying to say it's only one or the other.
Right, I know you weren't, yeah.
In fact, the cultural change from my point of view is increasingly coming from the millennial generation.
Right.
But the changes of farmers who are actually practicing on the land, like the farmers in David Montgomery's book, it's going to be the economic drivers that, because, if they're losing money, which is what they were doing, and that's what the main driver that said, we just can't do this anymore. And then they need to know what are the alternatives.
I've been following a couple of those farmers that David Montgomery wrote about. One is in Bismarck, North Dakota, named of Gabe Brown, and the other is David Brandt in Ohio. And they've been practicing no-till and cover crops for several decades now. And I also read that the 2017 Census of Agriculture that now has been published says that we now in the United States have more land in no-till than we do in tillage. Now, looking around the central, the Des Moines lobe in Iowa, that's not true. But nationwide, it looks like we have gotten over that hump anyway, and are well on our way to no-till. And no-till is a solution to climate change, by the way, which I won't go into. But I wanted to read a paragraph out of Leopold that I think is very striking concerning the land ethic. He said, "I have purposely presented the land ethic as a product of social evolution because nothing so important as an ethic is ever written. Only the most superficial student of history supposes that Moses wrote the Decalogue. It evolved in the minds of a thinking community, and Moses wrote a tentative summary of it for a seminar. I say tentative because evolution never stops." And here he is saying no one ever writes an ethic, and yet he's doing it. It's very ironic.
Yeah, thank you for that. And Gabe Brown, of course, was one of the farmers in David Montgomery's book. And his farm is only 70 miles from my farm in North Dakota, so I've known Gabe for a long time. And the other thing is that I think important for us to recognize is that he has always had good relationships with people who are measuring, the quality of the soil, etc. And he points out now that when he first started to do this 21 years ago, his soil only absorbed a ½ inch of rainwater an hour. Now it absorbs 14 inches of rainwater an hour. Now, if you think about climate change and more droughts and more heavy rains and flooding, if you have that kind of capacity in the soil to absorb moisture, you're going to have more moisture in the soil during the drought periods, and you're going to have more absorption during the heavy rain periods. And it's one of the things that, in my conversation with Gabe Brown, that he's actually discovered already happening, and it's one of the reasons that he will never go back, to farming in terms of intensive input systems, both for economic reasons and for ecological reasons.
Okay, we're going to have to wrap it up under time constraints, but we have one last question. So.
Now knowing that the average age of a farmer in Iowa is 57, I think, we have to find ways to draw more young people into it, and those that are interested, are looking for ways to do it. I think the Farmers Union, the Iowa Farmers Union, is one organization that everybody here should learn about and become a member of if you're interested in these issues that we've talked about today. Whether or not you want to yourself become a farmer or maybe find ways to help promote younger people entering the profession. So.
Yeah, another really important point, and of course you're exactly right. And to me, again, I try to face both the difficult challenges and the hopefulness. And one of the things that on the hopefulness side that I see for young farmers in Iowa, if they want to farm, they can't get 1,000 acres either to rent it at the cost of rental or certainly to buy it. And so if you're a young farmer in Iowa and you want to farm, what do? You either join a CSA, you become part of farmer's market situation, and you will get 3, 4, 5 acres and raise food for people. And it's not that it's not challenging. Many of them work really hard. I don't know once they get to be 50 years old whether they're still going to be able to do that. But maybe by the time they're 50, we're going to see some of these cultural changes, which we're going to have in Iowa. Because again, especially now as prices for farmers for corn and soybeans are going down, they're increasingly losing money, and so they can't continue to do that. So again, there are going to be a lot of economic drivers as well as cultural drivers. And the important thing for all of us is to, first of all, to recognize it, to appreciate it, and to become part of supporting the kinds of directions that we know we need to move in. And that's why Leopold's work is so important, because he saw the fundamental cultural components of this and wrote about it in such practical ways that I don't know of anything that's more important than his writings in terms of making this cultural shift that we need to make.
Thank you, Brad. Sorry. She cut me off. Thanks, Fred, and thank you for all of your participation this afternoon. And I'm going to give away 2 more Sand County Almanacs before we close. One to Kathranne and Deb Fink. So in closing, again, appreciate you for being here today. For those of you who are not active participants, we're glad you were here. And look forward to hearing any comments you might have about what we might do next year. We have about 40 minutes before the library closes, so I encourage you to go upstairs and visit Kevin's and Kathranne's reimagined Leopold exhibit. And I think he has some markers you can write on plexiglass on the Tree of Heaven display, which I found incredibly interesting. So thanks again. There's still some coffee, fruit, and goodies in the back. Help yourself to that before you leave, and safe travels home. Thank you.
Thank you.